Welcome to Virtual Agile Meetings. I'm Ian Main. I'm really pleased to have Jim Wyllie from London giving us this presentation called Scrum 101, The Basics and Beyond, an Evolution of Agile with Scrum. Just give you a quick experience in helping organizations across a number of different industries to adapt and evolve their Agile thinking. You'll start by, I'm reading the wrong part. I'll keep going. So Jim's an Agile coach who has spent more than a decade working in teams in London and across Europe. He runs Agile Principles Limited and is active in the London Agile and Lean community. He's co-author of Scrum 101, the most frequently asked questions about Scrum and Agile, a blogger and conference speaker, and active in the London Agile and Lean communities. Certified Scrum Master, Scrum Professional, Professional Scrum Master 1, and IC Agile Certified Professional Agile Coach. So take it away, Jim. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ian. Like I said, a talk of two parts, and hopefully it's a talk with you rather than a talk at you. So please feel free to ask those questions as we go along. So I want to start by talking to you about Agile, or at least the way that I see Agile. And I see it as a function of people. So, you know, how we communicate, how we collaborate, how we make decisions together, how we resolve conflict together. And really sort of looking at it as a set of principles that help us define what we work on and why. And the why bit is a very important part of that, rather than just the what. How we do that work, and how we work together. So those are the three facets of it. Taking into account the four things you see on the screen there. So if we're not focused on any of those four things, my feeling is that we're not thinking appropriately about Agile in context. So when I say it's a function of people, I think it's two main groups of people. So there's the customer, i.e. the people with needs, and there's you or us or we, i.e. the people that are working to identify and meet those customer needs. So I guess to talk about needs a little bit, needs aren't necessarily wants. So just because you want something doesn't mean that's what you need. And we have to work together to identify where that's the case. Simply just asking the question, what is it that you want, is probably not enough in most cases. Having that close conversation with the customer to try and really understand what they're driving at and what they need from us is very important. And these aren't kind of laundry lists of requirements either. I think if you ask the question, what do you want? You will get a big laundry list of stuff. And the temptation there is just to kind of build this backlog out and find some way of prioritizing, I guess, but then just start working through this list. That isn't how I see Agile thinking being applied. It's real needs identified through positive interactions with our customer and with each other. Most of you will recognize this as the Agile Manifesto. Some background on this then really, 17 people coming together in Snowbird in the US, that's Salt Lake City, Utah, in 2001. And these 17 people came from all sorts of different backgrounds. There were some Scrum people, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. There were some people that liked XP, RUP, DSDM, Crystal. They all had different ways of working. And what they wanted to do was come together and find some common ground, some kind of not generic, but kind of broad ways of expressing the values and principles by which they worked, and putting those down on paper. And this is what they came up with. And if you look at agilemanifesto.org, it's a very, very basic website. You'll see it, but it does the job. It does the job of just basically very clearly stating what they value and the principles by which they work. Two of those people, Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland, were the inventors, or the inventors. They popularized Scrum. So they sort of presented that back at conferences in around the mid-90s. But they are two of those 17 people, the original signatories of the Agile Manifesto. So that's the initial connection between Agile and Scrum. The mistake that we often make, I think, with the Agile Manifesto is that we look at the middle bit and we forget the bits around it. So we read the 4 value statements, but what we forget to do is to put those in the context of the rest of the manifesto here. So the last line there, while there is value in the items on the right, we value on the items on the left more. So what we're not saying is the stuff on the right shouldn't happen. So there's lots of myths going around about, there's no planning in Agile. We don't write any documentation in Agile. I don't believe any of that's true. I don't believe that that is what they were aiming at when they put this together. What they were looking for was different ways of doing it. So the current methods, some of which are still prevalent, in 2020 as they were in 2001, weren't working for them, and they wanted some other way of doing it. And the common thread was they all felt that way. So just because we prefer working software doesn't mean that we're not going to document anything. Just because we want to respond to change doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a plan. Yeah, something has to change, so we should have that plan in the first place. Any thoughts on that? Actually, I'd like to gather a few thoughts on that before we move on. Does it resonate with everybody?
I think, at least from my perspective, I kind of wonder why some people seem to exclude the items on the right when they're talking about Agile in general. So why do people have the impression that there is no documentation in Agile?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it?
I've seen the same, Jim. Yeah. I think people read the 4 principles, the values, but then they missed the last line about the fact that we're not discounting the stuff on the right. We're just putting more value on the left.
Yeah, I mean, practically speaking, when we come to apply this stuff, it's not possible to ignore the stuff on the right. If you actually, through the act of trying to deliver software or do any kind of, I guess, knowledge work, you can't ignore those things on the right. You have to do those things. It's how you act, it's how you operate in the act of doing that stuff, I think, that matters. So yeah, we can't forget the things on the right, we just value the things on the left more. I think that's true.
With the third one, with customer collaboration, if you're working with an internal customer, like part of the business, then that's one situation. But if you're working with an external customer, it really does come down to a lot of trust and relationship to be able to be successful in that situation. It's hard for companies to not want to lock down everything in contracts. That causes lots of difficulties for the team.
Yeah, you need access to that person, and the customer's different in every context. We might be talking about kind of business to business contract negotiation. Ian, you and I work in an environment where we've probably got more than one customer. We have internal customers, but those internal customers also have individuals as well as businesses that they have as their customer base. So we have to treat those scenarios differently in some cases. And if you've seen the first page, you've undoubtedly seen this page as well. And these are the 12 principles that sit behind the Agile Manifesto. All I've done here really is highlight some of the key things in bold. So statements 1, 3, and 7, just to draw attention to those. Early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Deliver working software frequently, and working software, there's a bit of a running theme there. And this is all about delivering early and often. So this is about how we work, and the principles by which how we should work. 4, 6, and 11, we've got work together daily. We've got face-to-face conversation. We've got self-organizing teams. Those are all about how we work together. So that's communication, that's collaboration. So we're seeing the values from the manifesto itself supported here within the 12 principle statements. 2, 9, and 12, we've got welcome change and requirements, technical excellence, and design. And the team reflects on how to become more effective. That's all inspecting and adapting. and again, how we work together. So you can see how those two things dovetail with each other. Any thoughts on the principles? Anything that stands out for you personally? So anything you like or don't like about the 12 principle statements?
For me, Jim, it's about the working face-to-face, having those human conversations in the moment. It's probably the reason why we can get things done so quickly, rather than just waiting for an email, sending correspondence through, etc.
Yeah, exactly. I think that talks about it perfectly. Absolutely that. The other thing to notice is that the language is all about the customer. And I think there's something in that as well. We can absolutely take quite a lot from having those conversations directly and primarily face-to-face, like you say. I find that much easier, even in an environment like this, where we're remote, we're whatever, 3,000 miles away from each other. I can still see you. I can still see the expressions on your faces. And that's a meaningful part of, good communication. If I can't see you, it's harder for me to kind of read how you feel about things. It's too much about what you say then, rather than your expression as you say it. So those are kind of really, that's the core of Agile, those two things. What have I got here? There we go. So for me, I guess the overall concept, work together to provide maximum value to the customer with the minimum amount of effort. That's what I draw from the principles. So that's what I think about when I'm working with teams and with clients. How can we best go about doing this? Working together to provide maximum value to the customer with the minimum amount of effort. And that's really what I take into every coaching engagement. Yeah, that doesn't mean a drop in quality. So when we say the minimum amount of effort, we don't mean you're cutting corners. It doesn't mean that we're creating loads of risk. It's literally how can we be most effective in getting to the value as quickly as physically possible, driving the value out of any potential work, not wasting time doing work that doesn't add any value. How does that resonate with everybody? Do you feel the same?
I think that's a really important part of it, is for people to recognise that it's not about cutting corners. It seems something where I've seen a lot of people have said, oh, we just need to get the MVP out the door and leave it as that. But it's about taking it beyond just being the minimum viable product and making it actually usable and testable, and a whole lot of other features as well. But you may go through that MVP stage to start with.
Yeah, and there's a whole load of tools and techniques that we perhaps won't go through today that help us to do that. As long as we've got this in mind, I think that's absolutely right. But we don't want to cut corners. Is it really viable if it's not entirely usable, or we've got to go and do a load of work to patch it up? I think that's a good way of thinking about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Scrum now. I need to move you again, unfortunately, just to here. Okay, so most of the statements that you'll see here are in quotes. And the reason for that is I've taken them directly from the Scrum Guide. So in this case, it's the Scrum Guide of 2017, which I think is the latest one. I had another look. I thought they'd published one last year, but I couldn't find it. So they're all taken from the Scrum Guide in 2017. They're not my words. They're the words of Sutherland and Schwaber. So Scrum is described as a framework within which people can address complex adaptive problems while productively and creatively delivering products of the highest possible value. So there are a number of things that we can take from that statement, specifically the bits around complex and adaptive problems. So this isn't simple stuff. Certainly, it's popularized with the software industry. It doesn't have to just be applied. We can use Scrum as a framework wherever we like. But in software, it seems or appears easier to be able to imagine the problem as complex, because we're using languages that most people aren't familiar with. And so, again, we're not, how do we define complex? We're not talking about, you know, putting a chain back on a bike. So that's an example of a simple problem. We're talking about problems that perhaps no one's ever solved, and certainly no one within the organization may have solved before, and problems that change. So as we do work, stuff changes. We find things out that we didn't know before, and that changes what we do next. And we'll come on to empiricism in a second. So I see Scrum as a framework within which we can apply the principles of Agile. So Scrum and Agile are not the same thing. That's another myth I come across quite a lot. People applying Scrum as if it's Agile. Scrum, in my mind, is a framework within which we can apply the principles of Agile, or we can use to apply the principles of Agile. The bit that I haven't written on the screen here, that sort of supports this statement within the Scrum guide. Scrum is lightweight, simple to understand, and difficult to master. So it's stated as difficult to master. Yeah. So it's very prescriptive, or a lot more prescriptive than other frameworks. And I think that tends to give people a bit of a false sense that it's easy. It is not easy. And if you're finding it hard, it's because it is hard. Yeah, it takes a long time for teams and for organizations to get good at using Scrum to apply the principles of Agile. So I mentioned empiricism. Scrum is based on empirical control theory. So knowledge comes from experience and making decisions based on what is known. And we only uncover what is known by doing some work. So a lot of projects I see are very, very deterministic. So we have this kind of laundry list of requirements, and we're saying actually success is defined by delivering all of those requirements. And we don't deviate from that.
On a certain date or a certain budget.
Exactly. Or we don't create an environment where we're able to deviate from that. Yeah, we're focused on outputs over outcomes, and I'll talk a little about that when we get into the scenarios. But Scrum is an empirical process. Yeah, so we do some work based on what we learn from doing that work. That determines what we do next. And it might be what we thought it was going to be, but more than likely, it won't be. It will be a variation of that. Yeah, we'll have shown something to a customer, and they'll either like it or they won't, or they'll have some sort of feedback that changes what we thought we might do before. And that's really, really key here. I'd say, you know, upwards of 90% of the Scrum implementations that I've seen have completely missed this point. And it is the core, really the core point of Scrum, is the empirical nature of it. So 3 pillars of any empirical process. I'm sorry about the kind of mid to late 90s slideware. Transparency, inspection, and adaptation. Yeah, so those are the 3 pillars of an empirical process. Can anyone give me an example of how Scrum helps us to embrace these things?
Scrum asks for a backlog, ordered. Therefore, what's coming is transparent to anyone, and what's in progress is also transparent, because there should be a board where the team are using that to progress their work or to track the work in the current sprint.
Yeah.
All information should be available to anyone any manager that's nearby, or everyone in the team, especially everyone in the team.
Yeah. We make that stuff visible on Scrum boards or through electronic tools. I'm not going to name any. Inspection adaptation we get from things like retrospectives. So yeah, Scrum gives us plenty of opportunity for us to kind of embrace these 3 pillars, yeah, and to talk about how we embrace these 3 pillars. So 2 takeaways there. Transparency, inspection, and adaptation are the three pillars of any empirical process. Scrum is an empirical process, and empiricism is essentially what we do next is based on what we've learned from what we've just done.
I think the retrospective is actually a really good example of all three of them. In order to get value from the retro, you basically need to be quite transparent with the rest of the team about how you're feeling. That enables you to do the inspection properly, and then to part of the outcome of the retro is, of course, to add an item onto your sprint backlog for an improvement. So that's part of the adaptation. So they fit really nicely just into that one agile ceremony there.
Great point. Absolutely. So in summary, Agile, a set of working principles. That's how I see Agile, at least anyway, in my opinion. It's a set of working principles. And we talked about what we do and how we do it, how we work together. And Scrum is an empirical product development framework. And I think the key bit there, for me, other than the empiricism, is product development. So it's easy to focus on projects, and I'm not sure we should go into that kind of discussion in any great depth. But if you think of everything as a project, you think of it as something that has a start and end date, and the temptation is therefore to get this laundry list of requirements and say, you know, we need to do this lot of stuff within that time. And it's much, much broader than that, and we need to do a lot more thinking than that. Okay, any questions at this point? Beyond here, I'm going to start going into Scrum in a little bit more depth, and we can expand perhaps on some of the thoughts we had there on retrospectives and the three pillars. Okay. So in Scrum, we have, well, there are defined three specific roles. We have the development team. So they do the work of delivering a potentially releasable increment of done product at the end of each sprint. We have a product owner, maximizing the value of the product. And we have a Scrum Master who promotes and supports Scrum, and a servant leader for the Scrum team. Again, these are all in quotes because they're lifted directly from the Scrum Guide. So not my words, the words of Sutherland and Schwaber. Can anyone tell me what the characteristics of a good product owner are? Any thoughts?
It's got to be something to do with the customer. Maybe they need a good relationship or a good connection to customer or customers.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. Yeah. So you might see them as representing the customer. I think of it as three things. So they need to be knowledgeable about the product or the thing that you're building, the service that you're building. They need to have time. So often I see product owners who are, you know, I've got 20% of my time. You know, they have another job, and product ownership is kind of side of desk for them. So that never works. So they need to be 100% committed to the role, and empowered to make decisions. If they aren't able to make decisions, and I guess, Ian, this is where you mean, when you talk about the customer, if they're not empowered to make decisions on the customer's behalf, then they're not effective in doing that job. Other things to take around this: clearly expressing product backlog items, prioritizing, optimizing the value of the work done, i.e. maximize the value of the product, making the product backlog and those sorts of things transparent to everybody, and ensuring that the development team has a shared understanding of the work to be done. So they are an important component in those discussions. Yeah. So largely they can't do this job in isolation. You can't go off and write a backlog full of requirements in isolation. That simply won't work. Or it might work, but it won't be effective. And what about the Scrum Master? Anyone put any thoughts together on what the role of the Scrum Master is within Scrum?
For me, I think as a developer, the most important part for the Scrum Master is the servant leadership side of things, where they're able, basically, they can take some ownership in helping me to unblock external blockers and make sure that I'm best able to perform my role.
Yeah, so I think that's right. So I've got facilitator, coach, remover of impediments, leader of change. These are all servant leadership qualities. I think you're absolutely right there. And last but not...
sorry, we're getting some good points in the text chat from Swathi about some of these. I don't know if you've got the text chat open or not.
Ian, are you able to read some of those out, please?
Ian, you're muted.
Sorry, that doesn't help. So Swathi said Scrum Master should be someone who's a good facilitator and know who to reach out to outside of the team, I assume, to help solve blockers. Yeah, so servant leader.
Excellent. Yeah, I completely agree with that. Servant leadership is the essence of Scrum Mastery. Absolutely. So as we've got some developers on the call then, how would you define the role of the development team? Well, I've got things like they're self-organizing, cross-functional with all the skills as a team necessary to create a product increment. They recognize no titles for development team members. So if you specialize as a developer or a tester or a BA or any other role that you might have in your team, we sit at a round table, as it were. Yeah, we're all seen as development team members. Skilled in our own ways, but collectively able to do the job in a cross-functional way. No sub-teams recognized. That's an important point that we lift directly from the Scrum Guide. So where we've got independent development and test teams, that isn't how Scrum defines a development team. Yeah, so we may have some specialized skills in areas of focus, but accountability belongs to the development team as a whole.
Daniel saying cross-functional and capable.
Yeah.
Vijesh says development team should own the stories. So
yeah,
I presume that means committed. They're responsible. And then Daniel says collaborative and joint ownership. So yeah, good.
That's it. So, where are we? Conscious of time, we're 25 to 9. So we've got 3 roles and we've got 5 events. So you may be familiar with these. The one that everybody misses is generally the sprint. The sprint itself is also an event as described by Scrum. A time box of 1 month or less. We have the daily Scrum, a 15-minute time boxed event for the development team. And the key part of that is for the development team, not for some sort of manager who wants to kind of oversee it or get an update. It is a daily planning session for the team to talk about their plan for the day, to form their plan for today, to talk with each other. Yeah. Sprint planning. A plan is created by the collaborative work of the entire Scrum team. We've got the sprint review, inspect the increment and adapt the product backlog if needed. Yeah. And the retrospective, an opportunity for the Scrum team to inspect itself and create a plan for improvements. So that's our inspect and adapt point. But really, I see these all as learning opportunities. That's how I coach teams with regards to all of these events. They're learning opportunities. They're forums for us to talk with each other. And there'll be different people in some of these forums. But it's an opportunity for us to learn through conversation, look at what we've done and try and work out how that determines what we do next.
Got a question, Jim?
Yeah.
From the chat, Swathi is saying, isn't accountability a joint responsibility of all of them? I'm not sure what
Of
all of
everyone
them.
in the team?
I don't know if that means the team or the team plus Scrum Master and Product Owner or what. You got audio microphone, Swati? I know some people had a bit of trouble, but who's responsible? They're saying Dev, Scrum Master, and PO. So all three.
Yes. So
roles.
there's no hierarchy. There's no hierarchy with the team. I guess that's maybe where we're going with this. So, you know, the product owner doesn't manage the team. I've got a 2-year-old downstairs. 1 second. Anna. Yes, there's no hierarchy within the team. So the product owner, the Scrum Master, development team, I use the phrase, we sit at a round table. That's a kind of King Arthur, you know, and the Knights of the Round Table type reference. Yeah. So, you know, King Arthur was the king, but, you know, him and his knights, he saw them as equals. And that's the way, there is no hierarchy in the Scrum team. You know, often we have people playing certain roles that might be more senior in an organization, but that sort of thing should be put to one side. Yeah. So to the question in the chat, absolutely, equal responsibility across the group. Any more thoughts on that before I move on? And so lastly, we've got 3 artifacts. So we have the product backlog, an ordered list of everything that is known to be needed for the product. We have a sprint backlog, and so, sorry, just to call out, known to be needed. Yeah. So in my opinion, these product backlogs are very short. They're very high level until they need to not be high level. We make them granular at the point at where we intend to do that work. Yeah. And that's planning. Sprint backlog, a set of product backlog items selected for the sprint, i.e. the things from the top of the product backlog, usually broken down at that point. And then lastly, we have the product increment, which is the sum of all of the product backlog items completed in the sprint plus all previously completed product backlog items. I think that statement's a little bit clunky, but what it really means is everything you've got in production plus what you've just built. That's what the increment means. Any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on product backlog development specifically? I think that's the interesting bit here.
In the case of items like technical debt and that sort of thing, I've often seen developers do up an item, put it in the product backlog because they've created some technical debt. Ultimately, that ends up with a pretty massive product backlog because in small pieces of technical debt seem to get deprioritized. Individually, they don't hold much value. So how can something like that be managed within the product backlog?
So I'm a great believer that you've almost got 2 types of roadmap, if you like. You have a commercial roadmap, which are kind of the bigger ticket items that you have on your product backlog that kind of demonstrate the value that you've just described. But you've also got this kind of technical roadmap that underpins it. So I see things like the things that you've just described as enablers. Yeah, so one should enable the other, they go hand in hand. Technical debt in my mind can be described as like a conscious decision to not do something in order perhaps to save some time. That's usually why we do it. Yeah, so at the same time, if we're taking a conscious decision not to do it, we need to take a conscious decision to actually do it. And for me, we do it in line with something that we can demonstrate the value of. Often those technical debt items, to your point, if they are very small, they perhaps don't appear to have that sort of value. But over time, as you say, as they build up, the cost of change just grows and grows and grows as your code base becomes more complex. It becomes harder to make changes in there. And so naturally, it becomes more difficult to minimize the amount of time it takes you to add value. So they should add equal weight, but one should support the other, is my opinion on it. How would you see it?
I guess in my case, as a developer, I tend to prefer to prioritize the technical debt because I know that it ultimately will come back and bite me at some point in the future. The problem I often have is getting the business to see the value in actioning that now rather than delaying it until it does bite us and then actioning it. Also, as again, although they're really small items, like each individual one is generally quite small, the sum total of them can be extremely large. And the more items that are there, it's almost an exponential increase in the risk that's being taken by leaving it there. But especially if you've got product owners, scrum masters, management within the company, etc., that aren't from a technical background, they often don't understand the risk that's associated with that until it is too late.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, you know, this is a conversation that's been raging for years and years and years, isn't it? Like, I don't think there's any one right answer. It's probably contextual, but yeah, it's a bit of a challenge. It's a bit of a challenge, certainly. You talked about value there. I think that's it. It's really about, you know, how can you best describe the value of doing that work now versus later? What's the cost of delaying that decision? And if you can articulate that properly, I think, you know, we've got a better chance of an agreement.
I guess
all right,
back to the developers being able to speak in the business language.
Yeah. Okay, so last slide on Scrum, we've got 5 values. So Scrum defines 5 values: commitment, courage, focus, openness, and respect. So those are the core facet, the core human facets of Scrum. And often I see teams being asked to make commitments, but without necessarily being respected. And with focus being shifted left, right, and center. In that regard, I guess you have to have some courage and you have to be open and have a conversation that perhaps might be hard and will get harder the longer that you leave it. So in Scrum environments, and this is really talking about the system, right? So the overarching environment with which a team works and is applying Scrum as a framework. We have to have those 5 things in order for it to be effective. So quick summary there. Agile, 4 manifesto statements underpinned by 12 principles focused on people and their behavior. And Scrum, 3 roles in the Scrum team, 5 events in each sprint, 3 artifacts defining the work underpinned by those 5 values. So you see in both cases, we talk about values and principles working together for the best outcome for the customer. So that's how they dovetail. A lot of people don't like Scrum because of the way it's been abused. I love it. I still, after all these years, I don't know, maybe sort of close to 15 years as a Scrum Master in different roles, etc. I still really enjoy it. I think it has far more positives than it has negatives. So I promised to take you through a few scenarios. I think we've probably got about roughly 10 minutes, so let's do that. And this will double up as kind of questioning as well. We've done that all the way through. So really, this is just applying the context that we've just set to a number of scenarios. Scenarios that I see quite a lot with in client situations. So scenario 1 is waterfall in 2-week chunks. I'll give you an example of the characteristics here. So only the development team have changed their ways, and they are still, in some cases, quite immature in terms of their understanding of these principles and practices. And when I say the development team, I just mean, in this case, actual developers, so not testers. I've seen plenty of financial services examples of this where we have a test team that's completely separate from the development team. And so we have developers working in 2-week sprints or 3-week sprints, but but they do all of that before they hand any of it over to that test team. We talked about outputs over outcomes. This is very output oriented. So we're still working in a, as Ian was saying earlier on, we're still working in a fixed time, fixed cost, fixed scope type of environment, where on time and on budget are the kind of key things that people talk about. Laundry lists of requirements I've mentioned turn into big requirements docs. Run books are full of test cases executed by hand. So there's low levels of automation generally in these sorts of environments. Yeah, so everything takes forever. And these tests are kind of written from requirement specifications. So there's no conversation had around it. We've created a requirements doc, and so from that doc, we write these test cases. So you've almost got a set of developers and a set of testers working independently of each other, only they're working on the same thing. So it's a bit crazy. I was determined when I went through these that I wouldn't be sort of damning of them, because I think when you're just starting out, this is a kind of scenario that you see quite a lot, and you almost have to go through these scenarios to really understand. It's that learning journey that you go through to get to a point where in the third example that I give, where you're approaching something that kind of, I think, represents what Agile with Scrum was meant to look like. Often in these environments, the results are predetermined, and so you've got strict change control in place. So if I want to make a change, if I'm a stakeholder in the process, I want to make a change, I have to fill a form in. And I've seen project managers in this sort of environment continue to work on something they know that they have a change request in for, but that hasn't been approved by the change board yet. So they're wasting time doing something they know will change inside the next 2 or 3 weeks. I've seen that sort of behavior.
Jim, what are the 3 lines on the build box? Is that?
Those are meant to represent build being broken up into sprints.
Okay. So overall, you've got...
I take it that's not obvious.
I wasn't sure if it was 2 weeks per block or whether it was each block had multiple sprints.
It's not. I mean, that's kind of, I guess, not that relevant. It's just denoting that build is broken up into sprints in some way. High defect counts due to very long feedback loops. I've seen that build phase take 6 months, and then everything gets handed over to a test team. Sometimes what happens in that scenario, certainly in organizations that use a high number of contractors, half the people that actually wrote the code have then rolled off the project before people start testing it. That scenario is quite common. And really no one who's doing any of the work has either met or kind of understands what the customer wants. That's quite typical.
And those deployments.
What questions?
Those deployments very rarely happen like 6 months apart or longer. When it happens, it's a whole weekend, and it's very scary, high risk.
High risk,
involved.
Absolutely high risk. What questions might you hear in an environment like this? How long will it take? How many story points did we deliver this sprint? How can we increase our velocity? And we need more resources is a question you often hear, because people are seen as a resource rather than as people who interact and talk to each other. What results might you see? Projects taking longer than expected, sometimes years in duration. You'll see a distinct lack of communication, no knowledge share, lots of silos going on, lots of individuals working on stuff. And by the time you get to the point that Ian was describing, this kind of big bang deployment at the end, you'll see an out-of-date solution, probably. So what tips might I give to a team who find themselves in this scenario? Try and align those build and test teams. So do what we can. The first step might be to get those 2 groups of people working together, before we try and solving this kind of upfront analysis and design and the kind of fixed time, fixed cost, fixed scope scenario is a harder problem to solve than simply getting developers and testers to a point where they're able to communicate and collaborate effectively. So that might be the first step that you take.
Did you expand on that, Jim, when you say working together better? Would you?
Talking together every day. Yeah. So having a joint stand-up with those two teams so that they can talk to each other, giving them opportunities to do that, putting tools in place that makes that easy, video calls. Often you'll see someone just dropping a comment onto a Jira ticket and then hoping that somebody picks that up. So we have to encourage those people to have a conversation together about the work that they want to do.
And if you're in the same building, move them from one floor to where the developers are.
Co-location absolutely would be useful in this scenario. And I've actually put here, perhaps even go back to a completely waterfall approach until you are ready to make the necessary changes required for agility. So often I think the wider system in this scenario is not set up to allow them to be successful in that way. And so you're almost better going back to where you were until such a time as you are, potentially. Ian, I'm very conscious we've got 5 minutes. So I'm just going to I have a full day of work to do, unfortunately, that starts very close to 9 o'clock. So I'll do my best to get through this without rushing it. Cool. Scenario 2 is kind of the worst of both worlds. So we've left much of the rigor that comes from a waterfall approach behind, but haven't grasped the collaborative nature of complex knowledge work. So that sort of change control process that I talked about has been taken away because that's seen as kind of old world, but we've not replaced it with anything. We've not replaced it with that collaboration and that communication and the understanding that things are going to change. And so what you get with this is really elongated build and test phases because scope is just constantly changing without anyone actually kind of taking control of it. And also we get a lot of scope creep in this kind of environment. Testers' time is squeezed, so defect counts are high. You know, stuff's taking time, so what do? We don't test it rigorously enough. We tend to cut that down. We've perhaps got a bit more automation, but we're still not quite there yet. Corners being cut to make up time, and I've put here lots of technical debt build up. We've had that discussion already. Questions you might hear in this environment: how long will it take? We're still hearing that. We're still hearing we need more resources because stuff's going on for longer. So the easy option perhaps is let's throw people at the problem. That will end up invariably slowing things down, certainly to begin with. Where are all these defects coming from? How many bugs have we got left to fix? And how do we have to fix our technical debt, exclamation mark. And so what results would you see? Projects taking longer than expected. And again, those kind of lack of knowledge share and those silos I think are prevalent in this environment. So how would I help a team in this scenario? Try to deploy more frequently to get more feedback. So we start to look at shortening those feedback loops in this scenario, focusing on collaboration with business and product owners to get out in front of that kind of scope creep and those changes. How can we avoid that? Well, we can collaborate a bit more effectively. And I've put here, if you are estimating, update high-level estimates at the end of every sprint. So if we talked about Scrum as empirical, so not just what have we learned and how does that affect what we do next, but what have we learned and how does that affect how long this thing's going to take? If that's still a key focus for the organization, we should update those things as regularly as we update our backlog. Last scenario then, we're jumping quite a way forward, is empiricism. And that was the best way I could think to describe it or visualize it. So we've shifted from outputs over outcomes to outcomes over outputs. We've got clear direction and statements of intent. So we know what the end result, the outcome we're looking for the customer, and that's clearly stated. And so people have purpose. We've got cross-functional teams. We've got close working relationships between business and tech teams. We've got direct exposure to the customer. We've got user testing panels. We're running A/B and multivariate tests. We have high levels of automation. We've got continuous integration and delivery. So we've got modern engineering practices in place and being used for the benefit of the customer and of the team. Teams have autonomy. Leaders are focused on building a creative and productive working environment. They're changing and shaping the system to support the team as they work. And we have a learning culture. What questions might you have? What are our customers saying? Why should we do this? What impact will it have on our customer? What have we learned? How can I help? And what do you need? So those are the sorts of questions you might get in a mature environment like this. What results might you see? Customers using and getting value from our products and services, people having fun and enjoying their work, significant increases in creativity and productivity. So I think if you're in this environment, you probably don't need too many tips, but the main one maybe I'd say is look at something like OKRs. So how can we be really transparent about what we're trying to achieve? Set out our objectives and give some really clear results for how we're going to measure the success of it. And those are customer focused. Just having done the thing doesn't mean we've delivered the value of it. So how do we really truly measure that we've delivered that value? So conclusions. These were my conclusions, really. I guess you'll have drawn your own. Agile is about maximizing the value delivered with the minimum of effort. People and their behaviors are at the heart of Agile. Teamwork beats individualism every single time. Empiricism is at the heart of Scrum. We can't know everything before we start. Yeah. So don't try and predetermine the answer. Have an idea about where you're getting to or where you want to go, but not necessarily how you're going to get there. Agile thinking can be applied without Scrum, but Scrum is a great way of applying the principles of Agile. It is prescriptive, but you still need to do your own thinking. It doesn't tell you what to do inside that time box. It gives you the forums. It also describes what you might do in those forums and what roles people play. It doesn't tell you what to do within that time box. And also there are many, many myths out there about Agile and Scrum, so question everything. Yeah, just because somebody says it doesn't mean it's true. Just because I've said it doesn't mean it's true. Everything's context. Thank you very much for taking the time to let me talk with you about this stuff. It's much appreciated. It was very good to meet all of you. I have a book. This wasn't a sales pitch. That book's 3 years old now. But if you like some of the concepts that I talked through, that book is available on Amazon. I didn't write it on my own. I had two co-authors there, our friends David and Jitten, who wrote this. But really that book is about kind of the basics. It's a collection of questions really that we've been asked at conferences, training sessions, et cetera, over the last 10 years, just laid out and answered, hopefully in a way that people can connect with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. If people want to contact you, how can they do that?
So you can contact me on LinkedIn. You have that.
Yep.
I've commented on the post that Ian's put up, so you can contact me on LinkedIn. Ian, I guess, I don't know whether you circulate these videos or whatnot. We can put my email address on there, but it's james@agile-principles.co.uk if you want to send me an email. I'm offering some free personal coaching as well. So if there are any Scrum Masters starting out who feel like they would benefit from some free coaching sessions, I've got 2 spaces available for free coaching sessions as well. So do get in touch via email. And those will actually be coaching sessions. It won't be mentoring. It will be helping you to explore the things that you want to explure. And finding the answers for yourself. So
Jim, I'm just going to say thank you very much, Jim. Really appreciate all the work you put into this, presenting for us. I'm just going to unmute everyone. So you're all unmuted now. If you'd just like to say thank you to Jim, and then we'll finish up.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim. Well done.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.
Cheers. Hopefully speak to you soon.
Jim. Have a good day, mate.
Bye-bye. Bye. Cheers.
See ya.
Thanks.